Joined us today for Austin Faith Dialogue. You know, there are a lot of opinions about a variety of issues, especially within the faith community. Today we'll be talking with a United Methodist pastor who will explain to us about his life of social activism and how that's led him to become involved in an issue that in many arenas is controversial. Stay with us for Austin Faith Dialogue.
This is Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program discussing the important crossroad of religion in life, produced by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues throughout our area. Now, today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
Welcome. I'm Sandy Wilder, your host for today's edition of our show, Austin Faith Dialogue. And with me is Charles Moore, pastor of Grace United Methodist Church here in Austin, and a lifelong social activist. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you.
Good to have you. Let's set the stage for social activism. Some people don't know you and don't know your background. What kinds of influences have led you to where you are? You know, where you grew up, where you went to school, those kinds of things.
I'd like to begin by talking about who I understand myself to represent, which is myself and anyone who might happen to agree with the things I say. I have never pretended to speak for the congregation I serve, now or at any time. I understand my responsibility as a pastor to speak to the congregation, and then those who think that I'm on the right track can go along, and others can disagree, as they do, of course, at Grace and everywhere I've been. It's very interesting where I was born and how I got started and why I have done the things that I've done. It's as much a mystery to me, frankly, as it is to most other people that I work with. I was born in a place that didn't even have a store in it. It was just a little crossroads. It's called Bug Tussle, Texas. And it's right outside of Grand Saline. Okay. And Grand Saline is a very interesting town. It has a section of town called Pole Town. And all my life I thought that that meant that maybe there were people of Polish extraction who lived there. And it wasn't until somebody else did an article on Grand Saline much later in life that I found out that it referred to the pole where the heads of lynched African Americans were put as a warning to anybody else. And still, to this very day, no African Americans live in Grand Saline because they are so unwelcome that they're not comfortable there. And that's kind of a shame to me for my town. But somehow it didn't make sense to me, even as a child. In my family and in my community, that kind of prejudice just didn't make sense.
So very early on you began to sense something wasn't right.
Yes, I very definitely sensed something wasn't right. And then I started out as a pastor very early. Too early, I guess, when I was in junior college. And my very first assignment was a little Methodist church near Tyler. And I went the first Sunday in June that year. It was 1953, all prepared for my becoming a minister. And there were 3 men standing out under a big tree. And I saw they were talking rather closely, and so I went over and introduced myself. And one of them said to me, "Well, Pastor, we're certainly glad you're here. The man who was here just before you was a communist and a queer." That was my introduction to being a pastor in the Methodist Church. And what I found out, of course, as time went on, if you translate that, what it meant was that he was not a racist. If you were not a racist, you were a communist and a queer.
So your predecessor didn't fit.
My predecessor, I met him later, was one of the finest family people you ever met in your life. But that was the way they saw him, because, and at that very church, my struggles for racial justice and so forth began. And I had a great deal of negative response in that little church.
Your struggles, what kinds of things did you do besides, of course, preaching?
Well, I didn't really do much, but any hint from the pulpit in those days, in the early 50s, in a little place like that, was considered highly revolutionary. And I made it clear that I thought the McCarthyite people who came and gave lectures with their briefcases supposedly full of incriminating materials against good people, I made my opinion of that clear. And I wouldn't participate in the annual minstrels that they had, blackface minstrels and so on, little things like that.
Right. Okay. So from that kind of formative experience, then where did the Spirit lead you?
Well, actually, that continued. When I graduated from seminary, I was an associate minister for a couple of years, and then I had the great opportunity to serve a church in suburban San Antonio. And it so happened that the Council of Churches there was attempting to integrate public facilities like restaurants and so on. And I was having a great time. This church was growing, and we were doing well. And I got involved in the efforts to integrate facilities, some in the neighborhood, and began to have difficulty. We were the first church, I think, in San Antonio to have an exchange between an African-American and a white minister, and then we exchanged our choirs. And then eventually, after I left, the church hired an African-American choir director, and that was sort of the last straw. That pastor was terribly mistreated over that. But then the next part of my efforts had to do with working with poor people.
All right.
I went to Boston to study at Boston University Theology School and Harvard Divinity School.
Because they had a particular program?
No, frankly, I just got burned out at San Antonio, and I needed a break, and so I went back to school. But I guess God pays attention to things like that, and I didn't escape. I met up with people from the Ecumenical Institute of Chicago.
Tell us something about the
Well,
institute.
this group started out here in Austin. They were the Faith and Life community near the campus of Texas University. And they moved to first to Evanston and began their experiment in corporate living. They got a big house, and all these staff families lived in it. But then they bought an old abandoned seminary on the west side of Chicago, where the community had been very prosperous, but African Americans began to move in, and the white people moved out, and things went down in a hurry, and the seminary moved, and so this group moved into the seminary and started a community development project, which is still going. I was just up there the other day, and they're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the establishment of a preschool in that ghetto. And I, with my family, spent several years there. And then, still with that group, I went to India and worked in the slums of Bombay for a year, and then went out to a little village that didn't have electricity or anything to begin with, and spent a year there.
Because they had had, what, an outreach, a presence in the Boston area? That's how you met up with them?
They came over and taught a seminar in Boston. From the staff came from Chicago. And I went over to visit then in Chicago and was much impressed with what they were doing. The group, it was something like the Peace Corps. People got a very small stipend, and they had housing and food, and such as it was, and health care, but virtually no pay.
But it sounds as if it had a religious dimension, since it was called Ecumenical Institute.
Yes, it began within the church, definitely, but as it moved out across the world to work with Muslims and Hindus and so forth, it was necessary to officially be a secular group because, you know, you can't evangelize in countries that are Muslim.
Right.
So the name was changed, or at least one aspect, to the Institute of Cultural Affairs. That's the group that I was working with in India.
What kinds of reactions then did you have to your experiences in India? How have those shaped you?
Oh, I was appalled, of course, by all the poverty, but I was appalled more so by the attitude of the Indian people. And we've just had a dramatic example now. They were trying to build a huge hydroelectric plant not far from Bombay, some big company in America. And a nationalist faction has killed it. The project is off. The same thing holds true for water projects and all the things that the people so desperately need. But there is a strong Hindu nationalist faction that says we don't want to cooperate with anybody, we don't want help from anybody, and the suffering that they cause people because of that rigid attitude is very sad. And I must say, I left India sort of like this. What can anybody do if that, as long as that's the prevailing attitude?
What were you to be doing there besides simply being a presence in the community?
Well, comprehensive community development. We started preschools for children. We established health clinics. We worked with the farmers to increase their crops. We worked on water projects. We worked on natural gas projects using the animal waste and so on. Anything they needed, we worked on it. And that was why we didn't have any dramatic success in any one area, because we insisted on doing everything at once. Other groups, you know, focus on one thing, and so we got pretty frustrated with the actual success that happened, although there have been lasting effects to that.
So back to the United States, and then what?
Well, I started being a pastor again, and became very concerned about the things that were going on in Central America. That was going on about the time I came back. By the way, I had gone to Europe and worked in a coordinating center in Brussels, which took me to Africa and Egypt and places like that for brief periods. And I got back, and Nicaragua was very hot at that time, and I took a year's leave and attempted to be involved in that, but as a lone individual, without a church, you know, without a pulpit, without anything like that, I don't think I had much effect. I really backed off for several years and just didn't get involved much, and wasn't planning to at the place I am now, at Grace. I really wasn't planning to be greatly involved in these things. But I came to Grace and discovered that there were family members who were dying of AIDS or had died of AIDS, and people were struggling so deeply with that, especially with the fear of being ostracized. Then some young men from the group called Affirmation, which is a group that works for better understanding relative to homosexuality, especially in the Methodist Church, came to visit the church. They visited churches in the city on a rotating basis, and a group came one day, and I didn't say anything to them. I didn't acknowledge them or say anything that would communicate to them that I was sympathetic. But they sensed something. You know, I guess if you have been involved in social action for a long time, maybe it's written on your face or something, I don't know. But a couple of them sensed that I might be somebody they could work with, and so they started coming regularly. And one was a young man who grew up in a Methodist church right outside of Tyler, in the same district where I grew up. And the difference between us was that he grew up as a gay man and had to hide it, and still his family is very uncomfortable with it, and he never had found a church where he could be accepted. And so when he discovered that I was open to that, then he joined Grace Church. And since then, several others have come in, and we have attempted to communicate that gay people, gay men and lesbians are very welcome at our church.
Which will lead us into our second half of the conversation in just a moment, talking about this issue. Stay with us for the second half of Austin Faith Dialogue after this short break.
Serving Austin means serving you. That has always been the primary goal of Austin Metropolitan Ministries. We are religion in action through the work of these organizations. Each plays a key role in making the capital city a better place to live, but we can't do it alone. Do you have some spare time, talents, or any resources that you can share? If you do, please call AMM at 472-7627, because serving Austin means serving you.
We're glad to have you with us today on Austin Faith Dialogue as we're talking to a local pastor whose life journey has led him to witness to a variety of social evils and whose personal experience now has led him to wrestle with what for many of us is a difficult issue. We're talking with Charles Moore, pastor of Grace United Methodist Church, and a personal witness to what a life of faith can lead one to. Well, Charles, in the first part we talked about your own journey and the formative influences on you. We've gotten to the point now where you have become involved in one of the hot issues, the issue of homosexuality. Describe what's going on with you these days as you work with homosexual people and their families.
Well, first I want to say I did not want to be involved in this issue. I am myself a thoroughly heterosexual person, and I've asked myself a lot why I am so much involved in this. When I was doing all that traveling in Europe and so forth, I don't remember just when it was, but the conference that I belonged to, the Southwest Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church, expelled one of my classmates. We were classmates in seminary when he said that he was gay.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of scandal about it, a lot of media coverage and all that. And his name was Gene Leggett. And after that, his form of protest was to go down to the altar when new ministers were being ordained every year.
Mm-hmm.
He put on a black armband and he would go down and kneel with them. That was his symbol of protest for what had been done to him. And I was back a time or two to attend the conference, and I had this urge to, for some reason, to go down and kneel with him, and I didn't. And since then, more than one of my colleagues have told me they had the same experience, that they're ashamed that they didn't. I avoided him. We'd have a reception afterwards, and I wouldn't want to be seen with him, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that was wrong, but I just didn't want to get involved in this issue. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anybody personally except this person who was gay. And I didn't really know for sure how I felt about it.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't until I came here to Grace that I got dragged against my will into this issue. But the pivotal thing that happened that caused me to decide I have to do something more than just talk about this. I was getting involved with PFLAG, the Parents and Families and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. That's a large nationwide group, and our trustees unanimously at Grace invited them to hold their meetings at our church. And of course I supported that. And I decided I would go and attend a meeting or two.
And you've already said that some members of your congregation were had members of their families who were homosexual, right?
Yes,
That there was a
but it
congregational
wasn't public.
connection.
That wasn't public to anybody.
Okay.
Anyway, I went to these meetings and I listened to parents and brothers and sisters and Some of the young people themselves talk about the persecution, the taunting, all kinds of stuff that they experienced just because they discovered that they were gay, not that they decided to be gay. That's a strange thing that some people think that you can decide, you know, one way or the other. A gay person, as I've come to know them, could about as well decide to be straight as I could decide to be gay, which means not possible. Anyway, I listened and I thought, this just does not make sense. They talked about attempted suicide, about the constant fear that they have at school and wherever. And then I thought, our denomination has an official position which says homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and so forth. Well, that puts any person who is gay in a secondary category as far as being a human being is concerned, and gives permission for the kind of mistreatment that happens to people. Now, I'm not saying that good United Methodists who are anti-gay would go and beat up somebody who was gay. I'm not saying that.
Sure.
But that official position is a sanction for that kind of anti-gay behavior. And I thought it has to be changed. And of course I knew that many people have been trying to change it since I think it was 1972. Part of the delegation from this annual conference, Southwest Texas Conference, same one that threw Gene Leggett out, wrote that language for the discipline, the discipline of our church, the Book of Discipline. And I thought, I'm a member of this group that wrote that, and I have a responsibility to change it if I can.
So listening to these stories of pain then impelled you to some kind of action.
Yeah, and I've gone to every meeting that you know, where I haven't had a schedule conflict since, because I just I listen in disbelief, but I also listen with great sympathy. And it was that, really. It was the coincidence of my involvement with PFLAG and the meeting of the bishops in Austin the first week in May that caused me to decide to do something to try to get the bishops to call for a change in the position of the church. Now, the bishops don't legislate. That's done by the General Conference, which meets every 4 years, about 1,000 delegates. But I have insisted to the bishops, without much success, that they have a responsibility to lead the church, not just to follow it, not just to wait till the General Conference makes the rules, and then whether they're good or bad, the bishops uphold them. And I knew that if I just wrote them a letter, which I did, that they would write me a note and thank me and file it, that I'd have to do something.
So earlier this spring then, you took a public witness, correct?
Yes, I took my vacation. I made it very clear that I was not speaking for Grace Church. And I took my vacation, and as an individual United Methodist minister, who happened to be a pastor, I could have been a teacher or some other kind of minister. And I decided to make a witness to the bishops since they were going to be here. I don't think they'd ever met in Austin before. And they may not ever again, but I thought, well, they're here, and somebody needs to say something to them. And I began to look around and ask myself, who is in a position to do this? And I looked around and I saw people with families. I saw people who'd only been at their churches for a year or so, or whatever. And the more I looked at myself, the more I felt I'm it. Just, you know, this is what calling means. I'm the one that's in a position to do this.
All right. So then what did you do?
Well, I talked to some of my colleagues who I secretly hoped would try to talk me out of it. I talked to a person who was very intellectual, I thought would give me all kinds of questions and trouble about the rationale for this. I talked to an atheist who I thought would laugh in my face. I talked to somebody, and all three of them did exactly the same thing. They listened to me, and tears welled up in their eyes, and they said, Charles, this is really frightening, but I think you've got to do it. So I couldn't get out of it that way. And I'd preached these sermons all my life, you know, on that scripture, I forgot where it is, about give your body as a living sacrifice, which is your reasonable service. I think it's in Romans, I think Paul said it. And then I heard this voice sort of saying to me, well, all right, how about April the 27th for doing that? And I found myself saying, well, God, could you be a little less corporeally specific about that? And the voice comes back and says, I don't want your whole body, I just want about 20 pounds of it, ounce by ounce, you know, while you do this fast. And after all that, I said, all right, I'll do it. How many bottles of water do I need to stock up to drink? And so I fasted for 16 days. And the bishops sent a delegation out to talk with me, hoping, I think, that I would just call it off. This was before they made a statement. And I told them, unless you make a public statement, not just a private letter to me, unless you make a public statement, I'm not going to stop the fast. So they went back, and on the very last day, full day of their deliberations, they passed a resolution. It wasn't a great deal, but it was enough. They decried discrimination, and they said if they'd been involved in it, they were sorry. And the most significant thing they did, instead of reaffirming the official position of the church, they recognized it. Very, very important distinction. And one reporter, out of his own prejudice, I suppose, not in the secular press, in the church press, changed their word, recognize, to reaffirm, which would have meant that the fast accomplished nothing, and I couldn't legitimately call it off. But I really appreciated that. That was a very serious and wise compromise. They didn't ignore the position of the church that they're supposed to defend, but they didn't affirm it either. They just said, we recognize it.
Thank you for sharing that story and describing to us how your life has led you to this point and to who knows what else. Because as you well know, and our audience does too, homosexuality is still a very difficult issue for many of us.
Indeed.
No matter where we are on the spectrum and what our particular faith community says to us. We'll have to have some more conversation at a later date to find out what else has happened to you on this journey.
If I just have 5 seconds to say one more thing. When I look back and see what a struggle it's been for me to come to terms with this issue, I am very, very patient with anyone who's willing to struggle with it. Now, when somebody says, my mind is made up, I will never, ever change my mind, I'll always be anti-homosexual, I can't work with that, but I can certainly be patient with people who say, I'm struggling with it and it may take me a long time.
We hope we can find some common ground on that issue, as well as with the other issues we struggle with, those of us who live by faith. Thank you for joining us for today's issue of Austin Faith Dialogue. We'll look forward to seeing you again next week.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 4